All right. Well, thanks, Paige, and great to see everybody here today. Welcome those who are joining us online. And we're in a series called Generosity on Tap. Generosity on Tap. You know, when we moved to Kansas City, I was born in Wichita, Kansas, but moved to Kansas City like in 1966, 67. And I wasn't born yet. No, really, I was six years old, something like that. And we lived down in Prairie Village. My dad had gotten hired by TWA, and that was when the airport was downtown. This was before the airport was built out north, okay? So the downtown airport, that was the main airport for Kansas City. And we lived in Prairie Village, Kansas. I went to Prairie Elementary School. And the YMCA put on a program called Indian Guides. And it was like an attempt to teach white people indigenous culture. And so I was like 7, and my dad enrolled me in Indian Guides. And it was honestly my first, I think, introduction to indigenous culture. And by the way, it has been critiqued today, and they've changed the name to Adventure Guides. There's been a lot of, critique around all of that. But for me, as a 7-year-old, I didn't understand all the different things that could go on in that critique. And I ended up loving indigenous culture. I started reading books about indigenous culture, started studying the history of, all that happened with indigenous peoples and the broken treaties and the stealing of the land and the bringing in of European land right concepts and all that kind of stuff, but I didn't know any of that. As a 7-year-old, I ended up developing a love for indigenous peoples, and that's really what it did for me. And it was a love that kind of continued through my whole life. I actually think that the vision of living beings extending to all of nature is actually a healthy thing. I think there's passages in our scriptures, our Christian history scriptures, that talk about rocks crying out and trees clapping their hands. And if you read Psalm 19, like the first Bible for all, living beings is nature itself, the first Bible, nature, right? And Psalm 19 talks about that. It talks about how creation speaks, and the voice of nature speaks, and it sees all of nature as living beings that we can learn from. And so I always love that, and I have a couple of books I want to recommend to you. As you know, I'm a bicycle guy and a book guy. Bikes and books, all right? So if you hang out around me long enough, I'll try to get you on a bike, and I'll tell you a book to read, okay? So I got 2 of them for you right here. This book was fascinating. Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. And she published this on a very small press. And it was published back in 2013. But it's one of these books that every artist dreams of. It basically became popular by word of mouth. And over the last 10 years, it's become more popular. She was a botanist, but her family background mixed has a heavy dose of the Algonquin tribes, particularly the Potawatomi tribe, which would have been the Great Lakes region all the way over to, even into New York some, okay? The subtitle is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, all right? The other one that I highly recommend, I bumped into this a few years ago. I had to get the coffee book edition because of the beautiful pictures in it. But this is called The Hidden Life of Trees. The Hidden Life of Trees. And this is Peter Wollenben, and he's an arborist, German guy who did a beautiful job describing to us how trees communicate through their root tips and through the interfungal connection. If you've never watched Fantastic Fungi or How to Change Your Mind, I'd encourage you to watch those 2. They're both on Netflix. So those are my 2 book recommendations. But as we talk about generosity, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer's book has some things that I think we can bring out and intersect with our Christian tradition that we can all learn from. First of all, it would be origin stories. Origin stories. Robin spends some time going into the origin story of how humans landed on this planet from her tradition, the Potawatomi tribe, okay? And so the story she starts out with is the story of Sky Woman. And Sky Woman, up in the sky, and that's where she existed before she fell to earth. And Sky Woman steps through a hole in the sky, falls down, and as she's falling, geese see her and flock to her aid and catch her to soften her fall. And she falls. She hits the water, and she begins to go deep down into the water. And the other animals see this and move to her rescue. And there's a muskrat that swims down, pulls her up, but in pulling her up gives his life for Sky Woman. And as the muskrat takes his last breath, he's got some mud in his hand. And the turtle says, "Put the mud on my back." And so they put the mud on the back, and Sky Woman is rescued, and she's so grateful, she begins to dance. She begins to spread the mud on the turtle's back and then begins to dance in gratitude on top of the mud, which then begins to expand, and the whole earth comes out of this mud on the turtle's back, and thus we live on Turtle Island. That's the name of our homeland right here, Turtle Island, by indigenous peoples. What's the beautiful thing about this story is that humanity birthed out of this story is in harmony with nature, not at odds with nature, okay? So that's a big point. An origin story where humanity is in harmony with nature, not at odds with nature. Now, if you think about the Christian origin story, and by the way, there's lots of origin stories, right? And our Christian one starts in Genesis 1 and 2. By the way, I went to Calvin's opening for his Paradise album, and Calvin wrote an origin story. So I would encourage you to read that one too. But nonetheless, our origin story, Genesis 1 and 2, it's interesting if you read that carefully, what you see is humanity made in the image of God, men and women both fully made in the image of God, and then they're placed in this garden, this beautiful garden sanctuary. It's like the whole garden is like a garden temple. And Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, verse 7, are called to tend and watch. Humanity's task is to tend and watch, to care for, to steward, to nurture, to live. It's a vision of harmony with nature. It's a beautiful vision. Now, what happens to many Christians and many of our Christian traditions, they actually start the Christian story in Genesis 3, which is a story of shame and cursedness and banning from the garden and separation. And what's happened, unfortunately, in my opinion, is that has become, for some people, the main story of Christianity. Like original sin becomes the main story. And I think if you start with that, you miss the whole point. Shame is a condition that I've experienced, certainly, but it's not our true identity. And I did a whole message, if you missed it, called Original Blessing. And I tried to draw out of Genesis 1 and 2 the true story of who we are. And I think one of those things is that we are to live in harmony with nature. As we do that, we want to live with nature in sustainable ways. We want to live in mutuality and reciprocity with all of nature and with all of human beings. And so as we think about this, there's a difference between a gift economy and seeing things as commodity. What happened when Europeans came to America, they brought in a different view of the world. And they started to begin to see things not as living beings that we live in harmony with, but as commodities that we kind of conquer and then we own and then we sell them and we trade them. And they're commodities, but what happens with commodities is that we lose our relationship with the person or the living being that produced the gift in the first place. Think about it. Us human beings can't live on our own when we're first born. And so just the fact that you're here means that you have received a lot. Just to be living and breathing right now, you've received a lot. You've had many, many gifts pour into your life. You've had gifts from nature. You've had to feed yourself to stay alive, right? You've had to draw from nature to drink living water. Hey, how's that? And you've had to live in harmony with other human beings as you live together. We live in community, in loving community, and in harmony with nature. But if you view everything as a commodity, we begin to lose the relationship with nature and with each other. So, for example, how many of you have ever received a gift from somebody that was just a commodity that was purchased at a store, maybe a big box store, and they gave it to you as a gift, and it really didn't mean a whole lot? Anybody have some items laying around their house or in your closets or in your garage that were just simply a commodity, and the origin of that particular gift is kind of almost meaningless, right? My mother, every Christmas, would put up a Christmas tree. And on that Christmas tree, she would hang the ugliest Christmas ornament that you could imagine, front and center, like right under the angel, at the top, was this ugly angel below her. And I made this angel when I was in first grade. And it was made out of something like flour and water, and it was like Play-Doh angel. Remember the Pillsbury Doughboy? It's the female version of that. It's a chubby little angel. It had wings, little chubby legs, just short little legs, good little belly. And I painted beautiful golden hair and blue wings. And literally, it's the ugliest angel. And I would have brought it today, but I can't. It's in a box somewhere. I had to box up my life a few years ago. And so one of these days, I'll show it to you. But over the course of time, the wings fell off and the legs fell off. So now it's just a head and a body, but it's still got on the Christmas tree. And my mom cherishes that gift. You understand why. It's not a commodity, right? There's a relationship with that gift and my mom. But honestly, if we could learn to live like that with all of creation, with all of nature, if we could begin to restore the relationship of gift, of receiving and giving, with what we eat, with how we live, with how we love. There's a beautiful vision here that Robin Wall Kimmerer brings out, and she's trying to restore this vision of generosity, of receiving gifts, and of seeing all of life as a gift. And we have a relationship with all of the living beings in nature and people who give into our lives, and then we also get to give ourselves back with love and beauty and grace and generativity. Proverbs 11, verse 24, 25, give freely and become more wealthy. And I don't like the word wealthy because we all of a sudden think of bank accounts and economy. But what we're talking about, the vision is scatter generously. If you want to reap what you sow, don't just sow one seed and check on it every day and pull it out of the ground just to see if it's working. That's sowing with stinginess. But sow everything broadly, and then don't worry about how it comes back, but it will come back. This is reciprocity. This is karma. This is sowing and reaping. It's a gift-type economy where we see that we give and we sow broadly, generously out of our heart of love and gratitude because we've received so much. Now we keep those gifts in motion and we give so much. And there's a flow and a relationship between gift and all we've received and those that we give back to, and now there's a flow of it. Europeans came to America, and indigenous peoples had this idea of a gift economy where everything's in motion, and you give and you receive and you receive and you give. But all of a sudden, American or European settlers started seeing people as like, oh, well, you're an Indian giver because you want something back. And no, that wasn't the vision. It wasn't like giving a single seed and then expecting something back in return, but it was a vision of gifts in motion, giving broadly, scattering all over, and then it all comes back, and there's a reciprocity of love with nature, with living beings, and with humans that is a flow. And that's the flow of generosity. And so Proverbs 11, verse 25, give freely, become more wealthy, be stingy and lose everything. Think about Gollum in Lord of the Rings. And when he got the ring, what did he say? Mine. It's mine, you know. All right, right? So that's the stingy version. The generous will prosper, but those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. Think about the difference between homegrown, homemade, versus store-bought commodities where there's no relationship. It's an interesting thought. Another thing that Robin Wall Kimmerer brings out is the difference between gift economy and private property. As you know, indigenous people didn't believe that you could own the land. The land is the land. The land owns the land. Mother Nature owns the land. The Great Spirit. We simply live in reciprocity with the land and with nature. We receive gifts from it and we give back to it. We live in sustainable ways with nature, with living beings, with one another, not in these ways that say, oh, it's mine. It's all mine. I hope you've figured out by now that you don't take anything with you when you leave this planet, right? We can try, go to the Egyptian pyramids, and some of the wealthy pharaohs, had a lot of stuff in that pyramid that were buried with them for the afterlife entertainment, right? But really, we don't take it with us, right? We leave everything that you might accumulate in this life, you leave it all behind. The old funny statement, there's no U-Hauls following the hearse. I've done hundreds of funerals. And, you don't take it with you. You leave it all behind. Who owns it? Who owns your stuff? Who owns your house? Who owns your car? Who owns your things? What's the ownership issue? And Robin Wall Kimmerer points out that in a gift economy, nobody really owns it. It's all just a gift in motion. The land owns it. We can't own it. We can share, we can receive, we can give, we can live in harmony. But if we try to own it and possess it, and then it's ours, and then we think about property rights, then all of a sudden, boom, where's it go? Now think about our scriptures. Psalm 24, verse 1. Who owns this earth? Great Spirit, God, Mother Nature. Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to him, for he laid the earth's foundation on the seas and built it on the ocean depths. So, God owns it. God owns it. It's not ours. It's not ours. It's on loan, right? Everything that we have is on loan. And Robin Wall Kimmerer points out how when we live in this gift economy, there's a give and take, and we don't hoard. We keep everything in motion. Everything is in motion. And we live in that reciprocity with all living beings. And we recognize it's not ours. It's a gift that we received, and it's a gift to be shared. There's a responsibility that comes with the gifts that we receive. There's a responsibility to share the gifts that we receive. Interesting verse that most people have never heard or noticed. In the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament is called the Torah. And one of the Torah readings, Leviticus 25, verse 23, says this: the land must never be sold on a permanent basis. This is God speaking. For the land belongs to, God says, me. So Israel doesn't own the land. You don't own the land. You don't own anything, actually. Like, who owns? Ownership. And Robin Wall Kimmerer points out how there's this beautiful vision of how Mother Nature owns, and we share, and we live in reciprocity with that. And I think that's really what the Torah is pointing out, too. There's this thing called Jubilee in the Torah, where people who have land and own it don't actually own it permanently. And if people have lost their land and fallen into poverty over the course of time, Jubilee resets everything and the land goes back to original ownership. You don't ever lose your land forever. So Jubilee is like a way of resetting a new beginning if you've fallen on hard times or into poverty or you've lost things and that kind of thing. It resets everything. And so there's this beautiful vision that everything we have is just on loan. And we don't own it ever, forever. And there's this, in the Torah, there's this reset for everything. And God owns it all, and we're just on loan. Do you think God sees boundaries? Do you think God sees private property? Do you think God sees borderlines? God owns everything. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So there's a change in thinking when we think about ownership. Finally, Robin Wall Kimmerer points out that there are ways that we can live in harmony with nature, other living beings, and even with one another through gratitude and awareness of the gifts that we receive. And she calls these ceremonies, or what we might call rituals. And they're rituals for gratitude and thanksgiving and awareness. And one of the things that her dad did, even though her dad had been separated from the Potawatomi tradition due to some of the practices that separated indigenous peoples from their lands and from their native ways, he still tried to hold on to, Robin's dad still tried to hold on to many of these ways. So they would go on camping trips and canoe trips up in the Great Lakes, and every morning they would get up. He would get up and he would make coffee every morning. And when he made coffee every morning, as he boiled it, it was kind of the style of boiling that they do in Ethiopia, where they don't strain out the grounds, but it boils to the top, and they pour off the top, and then they have this beautiful, flavorful coffee, not even similar to French press. It's like I've heard some people call it cowboy coffee, right? Where you just boil it all together, and then you just let the grounds float to the top, and you peel off the top. Well, her dad would boil the coffee and then pour the top grounds into the land. And as those grounds soaked into the land and became one with the humus, he would give thanks to Tawawas. Tawawas was the indigenous name for Mount Macy. And he would give thanks to Tawawas, the Great Spirit. And that means, it's a mountain, and that means cloud splitter. And so he would always give thanks for his morning coffee as he poured out the grounds, as the grounds intermingled and became one with the humus, and give thanks to Tawas. She often asked her dad, how far back does that tradition go? And she wanted to know the richness of that, because as a botanist, she trained in science and learned all the scientific names for plants, but realized that the scientists didn't see plants as living beings, and they didn't realize that plants communicated and lived in harmony with each other and shared information. If you want to read about the trees, the hidden life of trees, you'll find a fascinating, vast communication system under all trees that's called fungus. And it communicates, and they speak to one another, and they have a language and a communication system. It's vastly beautiful, right? And so she was thinking that there was some great, huge tradition, and she was trying to figure it out and asking her dad about it, and he would give answers. But one day, he said, what really happened, Robin, was that I was just trying to make up my own ceremony for coffee. And I was trying to realize that coffee was a gift, and because of the way I was raised in indigenous culture, I saw everything as a gift and every living being as contributing. And so really, it was a practical thing where I just peeled off the top of the coffee and I dumped the grounds out, but I wanted to give thanks. And Robin was a little disappointed by that answer. It was too practical, right? It wasn't quite the living being thing that she realized, but then she realized, but that ceremony had value. Why? Because it brought somebody into the moment of awareness. That's what meditation really does. It brings us into the moment of awareness, gratitude and awareness. You know, we live such frantic lives. Our minds race backward toward regrets and forward toward future worries. But our brains have a hard time settling down and living right now in this moment with gratitude and with awareness. And ceremonies that connect us with God and with nature and with living beings and with one another and bring forth gratitude are beautiful ceremonies to enact. And we can all enact our own ceremonies and our own rituals. We can do these with ourselves. We can do these with nature. We can do these with family. We can do this with community. We can do this with faith communities. And we're going to do it today. We have a ritual called the Lord's table, right? And it's a beautiful table. And it's acknowledgement that the bread and the wine come from this living, beautiful place that we all inhabit. I want to read Psalm 119 or Psalm 19. The first Bible, nature. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day, they continue to speak. Night after night, they make him known. It's a beautiful way to live, in gratitude, in awareness, and to create rituals that help us move into this moment right now. I'm going to ask Calvin to come up and lead us in a song of reflection as we think about generosity on tap, gift economies.